Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the Smith-Riffel Film Center. My name is Gaetano Maida. I'm Executive Director of Buddhist Film Foundation, and we're co-presenting this with the California Film Institute, which owns this beautiful theater. And I have to say, you are here in for a very special event. We're extremely lucky to have with us not only the filmmaker of The Mountain Path, but the author of the book that inspired the filmmaker to move to China many years ago and make this film. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I have a couple of program notes to make you aware of. At a Memorial Day weekend, a friend of ours, filmmaker Frederick Marks, who was part of the Hoop Dreams team, and which won an Academy Award, and then he made a film called Journey from Zangsar not too long ago, has a trilogy, 3 programs over the Memorial Day weekend called Veterans Journey Home. It's about his work with veterans and dealing with trauma, and he's got some extraordinary stories to impart in this series of films. So that's Memorial Day weekend for those of you who don't go away. Then on June 5th, which is also a Sunday, like today, we have another event coming up, and we're going to present 2 standouts from our recent Burma Spring Benefit Film Festival, which we ran to raise money for the nonviolent resistance to the military coup there. And these 2 films are, one of them is a feature film called Golden Kingdom, and the filmmaker Brian Perkins will be here. He's just back from a month on the Poland-Ukraine border. He probably has stories to tell about that, but the film was made before the military coup in Burma. It's an extraordinary piece of work, would be impossible to make today. And we're showing it with a brilliant short film called Guardians of Paradise, also filmed on location in Burma just before the military coup last year. And it's a beautiful piece. Brian Perkins will be here, and we have a guest moderator. His name is Kenneth Wong. He's a Burmese American, lives in San Francisco. He's well known as a translator of Burmese, and he's an artist himself, and he will be here to introduce the film and enter into conversation with Brian Perkins about all things Burma, Myanmar. And that's June 5th, right here, 4:15 p.m. I misspoke that once, on Sunday, June 5th. So I hope you can join us for that. Many of you know that we normally do our International Buddhist Film Festival in June. Last year we had to postpone it. We actually presented our festival in December. So as a result, we're not having a festival this June, but we are going to be doing these special screening events all throughout the year. Right down into, I think, November at this point. So if you are interested in this kind of programming, please go to our website, BuddhistFilmFoundation.org, and sign up for our email, because that's the best way to keep track of what we're doing, unless you are an inveterate Facebook fan, in which case occasionally you'll see a little bit of a notice from us. We're not big, we're not digital natives, so it's not our first run. Email is our first approach. Today's film is called The Mountain Path, and it's an extraordinary work by a young filmmaker, filmed on location in China, and as I said before, inspired by a book called this is the original edition, Road to Heaven, written by Bill Porter. And this is a book that is a journey. It's a exploration of the possibility that there were still living hermit monks in the Zhongnan Mountains. I'm going to get that pronunciation eventually. The Zhongnan Mountains in China. And Bill Porter found many living practitioners, and their stories are incredible. They're in this book, which is available on the table back there. Our filmmaker took that as his lead and went and made a documentary exploring that world. So he's here with us. Bill Porter, who has been signing books at the front table there, is here with us, and we'll have a conversation and Q&A after the screening. Please stay for that. And if you have purchased a book and you didn't get a chance for Bill to sign it, he will be at that table after our Q&A. And if you've missed your chance to buy a book, you rushed in and didn't realize an extraordinary selection was available, they will still be there after the screening, and you can buy them and get Bill to sign them. It's a very, very special opportunity. He rarely leaves his abode in Port Townsend, Washington. So I want to invite you to enjoy the film, and please stay for the Q&A and conversation that we'll have afterwards. And please consider making your way back to that table and getting a book or two of Bill Porter's, also known as Red Pine, of his beautiful books, translations from Chinese poets and Chinese Buddhist texts, Chinese Taoist texts, an extraordinary range of work. And Bill's here. He's not going to be here again. So we're hoping that you take advantage of that. So please enjoy the film. We'll see you after the screening right here on stage. And I hope you can stay with us for that. Thanks. Let's have a round of applause for that film. I want to welcome to the stage filmmaker Ted Berger and author-translator Bill Porter. So you've been on a journey, and both of these gentlemen have taken that journey before us, and I thought I would first say that translation is an extraordinary gift. It's very much like any other adventure and exploration. It's into foreign territory. It's often an unknown territory, and their job is to bring back jewels, to bring back something authentic, and to share it with us. And we're very fortunate tonight. I want to just give a shout out to another translator who's in the audience, Kazuhaki Tanahashi, I'm sorry. And he's here. He's also Bay Area treasure, translated several of these similar texts, the Heart Sutra and Dogen and the Cold Mountain Poems. And please wave, give a hand, thank you. And the translation community is small, and they all know each other, and it's something mysterious when they're able to find in a foreign language, in this case Chinese, and bring to us something extraordinarily accessible and also authentic. So thank you, Bill, for coming, and thank you, Ted, for coming. They both traveled here on their own. Bill, I want to, since this film has been blamed on you, I want to ask you, what got you to leave the United States and end up in Chinese monastery, a Taiwanese monastery, and eventually wandering around meeting hermit monks in China? Is it on? Yeah.
Now it's on. Now it's on?
Yes, it is.
Well, I never had any interest or intention to have anything to do with China or Chinese or even Buddhism, but I wanted to get a PhD in anthropology and study with Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict at Columbia. So I applied to grad school there, and I needed financial aid, so I checked all the fellowships that were available. And there was a language fellowship. It had to be a rare language for an American at that time. This was 1970, and I had just read a book by Alan Watts called The Way of Zen. It had some Chinese characters in it, and I really liked the ideas in the book. So I just, on a whim, wrote in the word Chinese, and they gave me a 4-year fellowship. But in the course of going to Columbia, New York City, I met a Chinese monk, and he taught me how to meditate. And I would go spend weekends with him at a hermitage he had up the Hudson, and I lost all interest in anthropology, and got interested in Buddhism. And the monk I met couldn't speak any English, and my Chinese was rudimentary, but I was impressed with him. I said, that's what I want to do. So since I'd studied Chinese, going to Japan didn't make sense. It was a cultural revolution, so I couldn't go to China, so I decided on Taiwan. One of my classmates at Columbia had been to Taiwan and knew somebody there. He had been to a monastery, so I wrote them, and they said, come on over. So I went to Taiwan, lived there 20 years, but just the first 4 in 2 different monasteries. But that's what took me out of academia, because I didn't see myself being a professor. I was looking for something, but it wasn't knowledge.
Then you escaped Taiwan and ended up in China hunting down hermits. How did that happen?
Well, that was just because one day, after I'd moved out of the monastery, I lived in this farming village for 14 years. And right after I moved there, an American knocked on my door and introduced himself and said he'd heard I was translating the works of Cold Mountain. And I said, that's true. He says, well, could you use a publisher? And so he introduced me to Copper Canyon, because the manuscript, my translations had been turned down by Weatherhill, Tuttle, and Shambhala. Of course, they were really bad translations, and I don't blame them at all. They were very bad, because I didn't, in fact, this man who knocked on my door was Mike O'Connor, who was a poet, and he really helped me discover the idea that if you're going to translate a poem, you have to make a poem. It never occurred to me. I just thought you put words on a page, and the poem somehow came through. But anyway, so I translated the works of Cold Mountain, and I had a Qing Dynasty edition, and some editor back in the Qing Dynasty had put another set of poems after Cold Mountains. This was Stonehouse's, and I liked his poems even better. So after I translated Stonehouse's poems, I had to earn a living in Taiwan, and I got a job at a radio station, and I used to interview people, famous people in Taiwan, and I interviewed the son of the richest man in Taiwan, a man who owned the world's biggest plastics company, Formosa Plastics, Winston Wong. So I told him I've applied to the Guggenheim Foundation after the interview. I said, this might be my last interview, because I've translated the works of these hermits, and I want to find out if there still are people like that. And he said, that sounds like a great idea. I says, well, if they don't give you the money, I will. And a couple weeks later, I called him up and said, were you serious? So that's why I went to China to find hermits, because I wondered if these people like Cold Mountain or Stonehouse, was that a literary conceit? Where there really were people like that? And I happened to just go to Beijing during May of 1989, when the streets, all of Tiananmen was full of protesters. And I happened to, the second day there, I went to a Buddhist monastery and happened to meet a monk. And I said, I've come to China to find hermits. Do you know if there are any hermits around? And it turned out to be the deputy director of the Buddhist Association of China, Jing Hui, who was a disciple of Empty Cloud, actually his personal attendant for a number of years. And he said, I think in the Zhongnan Mountains, south of Xi'an. Actually, he didn't say south of Xi'an. I didn't know where the Zhongnan Mountains were. So that's what took me there. I wanted to find out if Cold Mountain and Stonehouse were typical. Turns out they were, other than the fact that they were really great poets.
Well, this is the book Road to Heaven that resulted from that exploration. Ted, you read Road to Heaven. How did that? How old were you when you read it, and how did that put you in the frame of mind that your next stop in life was China?
Yeah, my introduction to Dharma started. So I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and there weren't, as far as I knew, there were no Buddhists around. But I read Kerouac's Dharma Bums, and I had an idea of what Dharma was at that time. I'd made some contact with it in books. And I guess I just really wanted to do this. I wanted to understand what this was, and I wanted to live this life, but I didn't have any way of contacting it, So when I read Dharma Bums, it was a big deal because here were Americans that were Buddhists, that were practicing Buddhism, and in this book, and especially Gary Snyder. Interestingly, I just discovered this in the first scene, one of the early scenes in the book. He visits Snyder in a little hut behind a house on a hill in Berkeley somewhere, and he's sitting on his in this little hut, and he's translating a Chinese poem. And I'd forgotten this, but just recently, a couple years back, when I went back to the footage to make the mountain path, I realized that the poem that he's translating in that scene is the poem that ends, "Sit with me amongst white clouds." And it was that, I didn't even realize it, but that poem just stuck with me over all these years, and it inspired so many things, But it didn't really take off until I found Bill's Songs of Cold Mountain. In a used bookstore in Portland. I found it. And I also bought a Chinese English dictionary. And I tried desperately to make sense of the characters, because his had English and Chinese next to each other, So I was looking at the characters and trying to figure out how to look them up in the dictionary, which was, fruitless. But I was eager, And then from there, I went to college shortly thereafter, or maybe that was when I first started school. And so I had there was a professor teaching Chinese, and I started learning. Finally, I decided that China was, that this kind of Buddhism, this kind of Dharma that was being practiced was what I wanted to make contact with. I wanted to know it. And so I actually wrote Bill a book. I wrote Bill a letter, and I said, hey, what if I went to China and did this? And Bill said, the Buddhist will take care of you. And that was my green light, really. Oh, I skipped a part. When I was a student in India, in Bodh Gaya, I found Bill's book on the shelf. I didn't actually know that The Road to Heaven was the same author as the poems that I'd read years before. I didn't make the connection until later. But that inspired me, because I thought, well, just like Bill said, these old poets, there are people still there are people that live like this. There are people that practice like this. And so I had to go and learn from them, so.
When did you decide this was a film? You weren't a filmmaker at the time.
No, not at all. I studied with my Shifu for maybe 5 years before I did the film. The film kind of recreates my process of getting there, but in fact, I had already been there many times and come back, and I was working as a translator on film sets. And I found out about DV cameras. It was a new thing at the time. It was 2003, 2004. I guess I was about 27, 28 years old. And I found out you could make a movie with this camera, yay big, $3,000, pretty reasonable. It seemed at the time. So I picked it up, and right away I went to see my Shifu with a camera and started gathering footage of him. And then he told me, if you really want to make a film about hermit life, you got to go meet, the hermits that live on the other side of the ridge, And so I wound up there. And then I went back and I reread Road to Heaven during that period, and I realized that Bill and I had walked some of the same paths. Bill actually I think he met my Shifu, yeah, and he was definitely at my Shifu's hermitage, and I think they actually met. There must have been 10 years in between or something, 15 years in between or something. But I don't remember when it was he went, but in any case.
The local Buddhists, I'd stopped at the local Buddhist association, and they gave me the election receipts for the hermits in the mountain, all those who had voted. So I went back up the mountain and gave them their record of having voted.
They said, here, bring these. You're going to see the hermits. Here, take these and go. Bring them to them. Deliver them. Yeah, cool.
Bill, in the book, you say that hermits are highly esteemed in Chinese society. Do you think that's still the case?
Absolutely. They play a different role than, of course, our hermits tend to be misanthropes, people who want to live just simply away from society. But the hermit tradition in China goes back 4,000 or 5,000 years, and the hermit has always, and it still is, an important part of society. The reason is the hermit, going back to the shamanic tradition and the early Taoists and the Confucians, and then fairly recently the Buddhists, they all fit into this role where you leave for a period of, assuming you have a practice. If you don't have a practice, then there's nothing to talk about. But if you do, the mountains are like graduate school. It's where you go to discover your own voice, your own words. And you can tell the difference when somebody comes down, whether they're just repeating, whether their words are their teacher's words or their words. So people generally go up for 3 to 5 years is what from my interviews I've discovered. A lot of hermits never make it past the first winter. And then there's a few who just stay up forever. They just like it so much. But they tend to attract people. So again, they're part of society. They're teachers. But generally they go down after about 3 to 5 years. And this was always the tradition among Confucians and Taoists and Buddhists. Even today, when there was a Chinese film company that asked me some years ago, about 10, 12 years ago, if I would go back in the mountains, and they would do a documentary, and they did it called Hermits.
We've shown the film.
And the man they chose to be the head of the film crew had read my book earlier, and when I did my interviews, there were about 200 hermits in the Zhongnan Mountains at the time. And that's just not my estimate. It's based on talking with the hermits themselves and the directors of the local Buddhist and Taoist associations. So about 200 hermits in the Zhongnan Mountains. And this head of the film crew had, in the meantime, used my book because I mentioned trails, distances and trails. So he had used the book to go meet these hermits, and he had personally filmed in the same area 600. That is, the hermit population had tripled since 1989-90 when I did my thing until about 2010 when they did this film. Hermit tradition population had not only tripled, the nature of the hermit had changed. There were many professionals, lots of Beijing University dropouts. They were intellectuals. Whereas the hermits back in 89 and 90 were just pretty much the hermits that we see in the movie, in Ted's movie. They were devotees, and their karma had led them to a Buddhist practice, and they had gone into the mountains. But the hermits now in the mountains are often, dropouts of the professional life or the university careers that they've, you know, this old tradition, part of society.
You wrote here in this book the old Chinese saying, "The small hermit lives on a mountain, the great hermit lives in town."
Yeah, they're always reciting that to me, but damned if you can find a great hermit in town. They are really good.
They're really good. I want to open up to the audience. If you have any questions, I think we have a mic. Do we have a mic? Anyway, do we have a question for either Bill? Yes, on the aisle.
Are there any female hermits?
When I did my interviews, based on the area I interviewed, 60% of the hermits were women. But I would say of those 60% that were women, about 80 to 90% of them lived in pairs. And usually that pair was a master and a disciple. Whereas if you saw monks almost always by themselves, but if you did see monks together, they were usually brothers. I mean, like disciples of the same master, perhaps. And then, of course, you get these famous these masters who don't go down the mountain, and they attract disciples. And so you meet these small hermitages where you, like we saw in the film, where you might get half a dozen monks living together, with a teacher and then some disciples. But lots of women you see, to let a son become a monk is losing, our parents are agreeing to do without that social security. Whereas a daughter marries out. They don't lose anything, just the opposite. They don't have to pay for a dowry. So it's a lot easier for a woman to get their parents' permission to become a Buddhist or a Taoist and to eventually go in the mountains. You don't just become a Buddhist or a Taoist and go into the mountains. Again, that's graduate school.
Any other questions? Right there. Yeah.
Yeah, I have an interesting question that occurred to me today prior to seeing the film, which was, would the film show a Buddhist hermit reflection of the power and symbolism and meaning of dreams in their lives, living in this vast wilderness, in their tradition, which I'm learning about through the film, is really quite a lineage. So in your direct experiences with these gentlemen, Buddhist hermit monks, and your own knowledge, does this particular Buddhist tradition encompass the understanding of the mystery and fullness of dreams?
Sounds like a question for you, Bill.
They see this, what we consider our daily life, as a dream. So it's really no difference. Is there a significance to our life? Is the real dream that they are interested in? I've never had. Maybe they just, I haven't met. Maybe there are certain monks and nuns who are priests in the mountains who have active dream lives, but they don't talk about it. Haven't heard.
So you would have to ask them directly.
I guess I would. Tell me about your dreams, but I don't know. Well, I'd be embarrassed to ask it, and they might be embarrassed to talk about it. I can't answer your question. Otherwise, I have no knowledge of these hermits' dream life.
Ted, I wonder, when you were making the film, were you able to get personal life stories from your interviewees, or were they intent on really just talking about their practice and Dharma?
I'm just thinking. Some of the hermits would talk about their childhood and how they came into that life. In the film, I only included my Shifu's story of his childhood, but the nun from Canton, she also talked to me about her childhood, but I don't even think the camera was on for those conversations. There were many conversations. Also, after I made the film, for years following, I would go back to visit my Shifu, and I would spend time with him, and then I'd go back and I would find the hermits again, and bring questions to them about practice or something, and so I talked to them many times after the film was done. That's of course not on camera, just me and them. There is a tradition in the to touch on the previous question. There is a tradition in Tibetan lineages of dream yoga. I see people nodding. You've heard of that. There's definitely that. But I think Bill's, in terms of the Chan tradition, I think Bill's answer is really straight to the point. We often talk about dreams when we talk about cinema as well, as an art form. But that inner landscape of the dream world, from the perspective of a Chan practitioner, is the inner landscape of waking life as well, right? But it's and there's actually the language of this that it's all like a dream, because we're experiencing. Well, I won't get into that. You need to ask a master that part. But yeah, it's in there.
Right here.
I had to notice their teeth, their teeth, health, dental health, and it's really a visual reminder of permanence, look at their poor oral health. And also, I'm wondering about your experience, their relationship with pain, because, one of your movies are a little romantic about it looks like a beautiful, benign environment, and you don't talk about so much the physical hardship involved as much as you might. But and then also, so I have that kind of question: how do they relate to their bodies and pain? And then also, you've been back, you went back many times. Have these people who would come to know through your films, are they still with us?
Repeat the question, because she's in the front.
First part of the question was about physical health and well-being, and how much should the hermits reflect on that? How much is that part of their narrative? And the second part of the question was, are the characters in the film still with us? I can say that I know that the old master with the beard and the 4 monks with him has passed away. I know that, but I'm pretty sure the other hermits are still with us. I think the hermit at the end of the film, the last hermit, I think he might still be there, actually. I know the nun from Canton came down the mountain. I bumped into her in a Zen monastery in southern China years later. It's a small circle, actually. So it's not that surprising that I bumped into her, because there's only so many places where someone like her would wind up to teach and to be part of the community. But as far as their physical health, these, as Bill mentioned, the hermits at that time tended to have grown up. I mean, just historically, if you think about their lives, where they were born, where they grew up, most of them grew up in the countryside. They grew up as farmers, and they came into a Buddhist life in a very traditional way. Like my Shifu said, his grandma took him to the local temple, which would have been just a small thing in the village, a small place in the village that he would go to. But that was enough for him to make contact with Dharma and to take on this life. Yeah.
One thing I could add is that when hermits when somebody decide they want to go to grad school, they don't usually do it by themselves. Usually their teacher takes them to a mountain. 99% of the mountains in China have 0 hermits. There are some mountains where teachers have been taking their students for thousands of years. They're like acupuncture points on the planet. They're power spots. And when the master takes the disciple up to the mountain, there's already problems, because usually the new hermit is really good at meditation, and that's about it. And so because they go to these mountains where there's already a hermit network, the old hermits look in on the new hermits, and very few new hermits go up with the knowledge of Qigong, and the old hermits teach them that. They definitely do not have a knowledge of wild plants, which plants you can eat, which plants can you gather and then trade for cooking oil or rice, and what time of the year do you pick it, and this information is always passed on by the old hermits living on the mountain. So in terms of health, new hermits have a especially hard time that first year, because they lack usually Qigong practices, knowledge of wild plants, and they had no idea it was going to be so hard. So hardship is part of it. Physical pain, again, they because of their meditation, they can overcome it more easily than we can. But the mountains are tough, but because hermits live together in an odd way. My own experience, I estimated hermits live about 15 minutes apart. It's like a wild animal's territory. Every hermit needs a certain area to collect firewood. They don't cut down trees. That's very rare. They pick up deadfall. So hermits have to have a water supply, and they have to have firewood, and they have to have some little patches where they can grow stuff. So usually hermits survive because there are hermit mountains in China, and they network. The old hermits look in on the new hermits and help them get settled, show them the ropes, you might say.
Oh, right there, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how the local political leadership relates to them, especially in the last 5 years or so. There's been so much more control of religion. I just wondered if you are able to stay pretty clear of efforts to control them, or other than that, how are people more recently how local power structures relate to the hermits and practitioners?
The hermit tradition is alive and well in China. The most famous nun, one of the 2 most famous nuns I interviewed, she had been a hermit for 35 years. The last time I saw her alive, there were 6 Communist Party officials in her hut. They wanted to know what they could do to help her. Because the nature of the hermit population has changed, we're getting different kinds of people with different backgrounds now. Like I say, the more educated people, people who don't expect quite so much hardship, they want a little bit better hut. And so one thing I do know is every hermit in China is living illegally on government land. And a lot of these new hermits are building fancy huts, and the government is tearing them down. Because one thing, when you go up on a mountain as a new hermit, word gets around about the nature of your practice, and word gets down to the authorities as to who's a fake hermit, just living there for the dilettante hermit, and who's there to do what the other hermits are doing. So there is a difficulty with the authorities always in China, but if you're really a practicing hermit, I've never heard of a practicing hermit being hassled by the authorities, but there are borderline people. I've heard of huts being torn down lately.
I think we have time for, yeah, we have time for one more. Anybody? There we go.
Bill, I really like the way that you described life in the mountains as a like a graduate school, but I'm finding it a little bit. I'm having trouble understanding what you mean by a monk finding your voice, especially in the context of the end of the movie, which I really liked, where the venerable hermit didn't seem like he had that much to say about certain things.
Well, I've often had hermits tell me, those of us who can't teach stay in the mountains. Those of us who can teach go down the mountains. So there's that aspect to it. Some people have an affinity for opening their mouth and teaching, and other people don't. So it's not like all hermits find their voice in a teaching context. But when you ask them a question, when you ask somebody who's been a hermit a question, and you can tell from how they speak. I can also just say this in passing. I've never heard of a master Taoist or Buddhist in the last few centuries who has not been a hermit. That's where you get your teaching voice. But it's true, not everybody gets a teacher's voice.
It's the time that they spend away from the monastic experience that leads to the hermit life is a moment to moment. It's a very rich community environment that shapes the practitioners and guides them in their practice. But when they go to the mountains and they're on their own, I feel like maybe that another aspect of this is how finding their own voice, meaning that their practice becomes theirs. It becomes, just by the nature of practice, as it deepens, it becomes more theirs, and then by the time that they're ready to teach, they have this rich experience to draw from, and it's their experience that they had in that solitude that I think is different from the experience that they might have in a community. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Nora, you had a question? No, I forgot your name.
Yeah, I mean, if you have time.
We have. You raised your hand.
All right. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about Taoism versus Buddhism in the hermit tradition, because I hear you sort of throw those words out, and I know that Taoism influenced the Zen tradition in China, but are there still Taoist monks and is that tradition different in the hermit life?
Yeah, it is. Just as the religions are different, or the traditions are different. But I'd say of the hermits in China, maybe 20% are Taoists. Maybe a little bit more, but probably about 20%. Because the Taoists have a problem, a historical problem. Taoists have led every revolution in Chinese history. You could imagine what the current government thinks about that. Because you get a leadership in China that's sort of like musical chairs. The music stopped, and they were the ones sitting down. It's unelected leadership in China. Members of a communist party, and the only communism you have in China is that which is practiced in Zen monasteries and nunneries. So Taoists pose a threat to the government. Like the Falun Gong, for example, is a typical Taoist syncretic movement that is the typical one that 1,000 years ago would have attempted to overthrow the government, because they have seen how to implement the Tao in society. They have a leader who has the vision of it, and they have developed a following. So Taoists have that historical reputation to overcome, and the government keeps a much closer eye on the Taoists. But there are Taoists, and the Taoists tend to be more active in communities.
I'm going to invite you all to join Bill back at the lobby table. But before we let you go, we have a little sneak preview of the project that Bill's working on now, which is a film about him and an anthology of his works. We're going to run that shortly. But before I let Bill leave the stage, I'm going to ask him to read a poem as a parting shot.
In my prime. In my prime. Is it on? Now it's on? Yeah. In my prime, I love the way. A Zhongnan cottage in old age. When I want, I roam alone. Wonders wasted all on me. Hiking to the river's source. Sitting watching clouds arise. Sometimes with an old recluse. Talking, laughing. Free from time.
Thank you.
It's a poem by Wang Wei.
Do you know it in Chinese by memory?
No, I don't have a memory.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both Bill Porter and Ted Berger for coming. I want to invite you all to join him again at the table if you wish. He will be signing books, and I encourage you to take a look at the extraordinary output of his prose work and his translation work from Chinese sources. And I want to thank you all for coming. So come again.